Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us back to 1855, where we follow Enoch, a young black boy whose life defied all expectations. While sickness devastated those around him, no disease ever touched his young body, a mystery that spread fear, faith, and silence among those who owned him. This is a powerful and unsettling story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 1855, on a cotton plantation 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a baby was born who would never know sickness. His mother named him Enoch after the biblical figure who walked with God and did not die. She could not have known how fitting that name would become. She could not have known that her son would walk through plagues untouched, survive horrors that killed stronger men, and return decades later to haunt the men who had treated him like an animal. This is the true story of Enoch, the boy they called blessed, the man they called cursed, and the legend that still echoes through the bayou of Louisiana to this day. To understand the world Enoch was born into, you must first understand Louisiana in 1855. The state was the heart of the American Cotton Empire, producing over 700,000 bales of cotton each year. That cotton was picked, sorted, and processed by the hands of enslaved people, over 300,000 of them across the state. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, under the brutal Louisiana sun. They lived in cramped cabins with dirt floors and no windows. They ate what their masters gave them, usually cornmeal and salt pork, rarely enough to fill their bellies. They were property listed in ledgers alongside horses and plows. They could be bought, sold, traded, or killed at their owner's whim. This was the world that waited for Enoch when he took his first breath on August 14, 1855. The Magnolia Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of rich delta soil along the banks of the Mississippi River. The land was flat and fertile, ideal for growing cotton. The plantation had been carved out of the Louisiana wilderness in 1792 by Colonel Whitmore's grandfather, a Virginia tobacco planter who had seen the future in cotton and moved his entire operations south. 3 generations of Whittors had built their fortune on this land, and 3 generations of enslaved people had suffered and died to make that fortune possible. In 1855, Magnolia was owned by Colonel Harlan James Whitmore, the grandson of the founder. He was 50 years old, tall and lean, with gray hair and cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He had served in the Mexican-American War and earned his title honestly, leading a company of Louisiana volunteers at the Battle of Materi. He returned from the war with a slight limp, a collection of medals, and an even harder heart than he had taken with him. His neighbors respected him, his slaves feared him, his family obeyed him without question. The plantation held 312 enslaved men, women, and children, housed in 47 cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house. The main house itself was a grand structure, 3 stories tall with white columns and a wide veranda where the Whitmore family took their evening meals when the weather was pleasant. Inside the floors were polished hardwood. The furniture was imported from France, and the walls were decorated with paintings of English hunting scenes. It was a monument to wealth and power built entirely on human suffering. Colonel Whitmore kept meticulous records. He had learned bookkeeping as a young man and applied those skills to managing his human property with the same precision a merchant might use to track inventory. He recorded births and deaths in a large leather-bound ledger, noting the date, the mother's name, and whether the child survived its first week. He recorded purchases and sales, listing the price paid or received, the buyer or seller's name, and any notable characteristics of the person being traded. He recorded punishments, noting how many lashes were administered, and for what offense. He recorded pounds of cotton picked by each worker, comparing their daily totals to determine who was productive and who was not. His ledgers, which still exist today in the Louisiana State Archives, tell the story of a man who viewed human beings as inventory. Nothing more, nothing less. Enoch's mother was a woman named Sarah. The records list her as Sarah Fieldhand, age 23, purchased New Orleans auction 1851, $475. That single line is all that remains of her in the official documents, but the oral histories passed down through generations of her descendants paint a different picture. Sarah was born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia around 1832. Her mother's name was Grace. Her father was unknown, possibly one of the white men who worked the plantation. Possibly another enslaved person who had been sold before Sarah was old enough to remember him. She grew up working in the tobacco fields, learning early that her body did not belong to her. When she was 15, she was sold for the first time, separated from her mother, and sent to a plantation in North Carolina. When she was 18, she was sold again, this time to a trader who took her to the slave market in New Orleans. The New Orleans slave market was one of the largest in the South. Enslaved people were brought there from across the region, displayed in showrooms like merchandise and sold to the highest bidder. Sarah stood on an auction block in January of 1851, wearing a plain cotton dress that had been given to her that morning. Buyers examined her teeth, her hands, her posture. They asked if she could cook, if she could sew, if she had ever been sick. They asked if she had given birth before. She had twice. Both children had died of fever before their first birthdays. The buyers nodded and made notes. A healthy young woman who had proven she could bear children was valuable. Colonel Whitmore's agent purchased her for $475. Sarah arrived at Magnolia Plantation in February of 1851. She was assigned to the field gang, working alongside dozens of other enslaved people to plant, tend, and harvest the cotton that made Colonel Whitmore wealthy. She lived in Cabin 23, a small structure with a single room, a dirt floor, and a fireplace that smoked badly. She shared the cabin with 3 other women, sleeping on a straw mattress that crawled with insects. She ate cornmeal mush for breakfast and dinner with sold pork on Sundays if the master was feeling generous. She worked from before sunrise until after sunset. Her back bent over the cotton rows, her fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls. She learned quickly that hope was dangerous on Magnolia Plantation. The other women in her cabin had seen too much death, too much loss to believe that anything good could last. Children died of fever. Husbands were sold away. Mothers were worked until they collapsed. The only certainty was suffering. Sarah adapted to this reality. She learned to love carefully, to hold people loosely because the fever or the master could take them at any moment. In the spring of 1855, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The father was a man named James, another field, and who worked in the same gang. They had formed a bond over the previous year. Not quite a marriage since slaves were not permitted to legally marry, but something close to it. James was a quiet man, strong and steady, who had been born on Magnolia and had never known any other life. He was happy about the pregnancy. He talked about teaching their child to fish in the river, about watching them grow strong. Sarah listened but did not allow herself to share his excitement. She had been pregnant twice before. Both times had ended in tiny graves dug behind the slave cabins. The summer of 1855 was brutal, even by Louisiana standards. Temperatures reached 104 degrees in the shade. The air was thick with humidity and mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke on. The cotton plants thrived in the heat, growing tall and heavy with bolls, which meant more work for the enslaved people who had to tend them. Several workers collapsed in the fields that summer, overcome by heat exhaustion. 2 of them died where they fell. But the heat was not the only killer that summer. Something else was in the air, something invisible, something far more deadly than the sun. Yellow fever had arrived in New Orleans in late May, carried by ships from the Caribbean. The disease had visited the city before, killing thousands in previous epidemics. But the outbreak of 1855 would prove to be one of the worst in the city's history. The fever spread through the crowded streets of New Orleans like wildfire, jumping from person to person, from neighborhood to neighborhood. The wealthy fled to their country estates. The poor had nowhere to go. They stayed and died by the thousands. The newspapers called the disease Bronze John because of the way it turned victims' skin yellow before they died. Doctors had no cure. They did not even understand how it spread. Some believed it was caused by bad air rising from the swamps. Others thought it was transmitted by filth and poor hygiene. The true cause, the bite of infected mosquitoes, would not be discovered for another 50 years. In 1855, doctors could only watch helplessly as their patients died. They tried bleeding, purging, blistering, dosing with mercury and calomel. Nothing worked. The fever killed who it wanted to kill and spared who it wanted to spare. And no one could predict which fate would befall them. By July, the fever had spread up the river to Baton Rouge and beyond. Steamboats carried it from port to port. Travelers carried it into the countryside. The plantations along the Mississippi, which had seemed safely isolated from the city's problems, found themselves under siege. On Magnolia Plantation, the first death came on July 28th. A field hand named Thomas, a strong man in his 30s who had never been seriously ill, collapsed in the cotton rows around midday. The overseer thought it was heat exhaustion and had Thomas carried to the shade. But by evening, Thomas was burning with fever. His skin had taken on a yellowish tinge. His eyes were bloodshot. He vomited black bile that looked like coffee grounds. By morning, he was dead. His skin had turned the color of old brass, and blood had seeped from his eyes, his nose, his mouth. The other enslaved people recognized the signs. They had seen Bronze John before or heard stories from those who had. They knew what was coming. 3 days later, 2 more workers died, a woman named Betsy and a man named Solomon, both from the same row of cabins as Thomas. Then 5 more died, then 12. The fever moved through the slave quarters like a scythe through wheat, cutting down the healthy and the weak alike. Colonel Whitmore ordered the sick to be isolated in a barn at the edge of the property, hoping to contain the spread. It made no difference. The fever jumped from cabin to cabin, carried by mosquitoes that bred in the standing water all around the plantation. Then the fever jumped from the slave quarters to the main house. Colonel Whitmore's youngest daughter, Elizabeth, was 7 years old. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a laugh that could be heard across the plantation. She was her father's favorite, the child who could do no wrong, who could climb onto his lap and ask for anything and receive it. She fell ill on August 17th. By August 19th, she was dead. Her small body was dressed in her finest clothes and laid in a coffin made of polished mahogany. The funeral was held the next day, and Colonel Whitmore, for the first time anyone could remember, wept openly. 4 days after Elizabeth's funeral, the colonel's wife, Margaret, succumbed to the fever. She had nursed her daughter through her final hours, never leaving her bedside, and the disease had taken her too. Margaret Whitmore was 43 years old. She had been married to the colonel for 25 years and had given him 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. She was buried beside her daughter in the family cemetery behind the main house. Colonel Whitmore himself contracted the fever but survived. He lay in bed for 2 weeks burning with fever, vomiting black bile, certain that he would join his wife and daughter in the grave. But somehow he recovered. He emerged from his sick room thinner, weaker, and changed in ways that would not become apparent for months. By the end of August, 61 enslaved people had died on Magnolia Plantation. Nearly a quarter of the workforce was gone, their bodies buried in hastily dug graves behind the slave cabins. The survivors were traumatized, exhausted, and terrified that the fever would return to claim them too. But in cabin number 23, something strange was happening. Something that would change everything. Sarah fell ill on August 15th, 1 day after giving birth to her son. The labor had been difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Sarah was already weak when the first symptoms appeared. Her fever climbed to 105 degrees. Her skin took on the telltale yellow tinge. She bled from her gums. She vomited the black bile that everyone recognized as a death sentence. The other women in the cabin began preparing her burial clothes. They had seen this too many times before. They knew how the story ended. But Sarah did not die. For 3 days, she burned with fever. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, calling out for her mother, for James, for her dead children. For 3 days, her newborn son lay beside her, crying for milk. She was too weak to provide. The other women in the cabin took turns feeding the baby with a rag dipped in sugar water, keeping him alive while his mother fought for her own life. On the 4th day, Sarah's fever broke. She opened her eyes and asked for water. She was weak, so weak she could barely lift her head, but she was alive. The women in the cabin stared at her in disbelief. No one survived the black vomit, no one. And yet here was Sarah alive and asking to see her baby. But the truly miraculous thing was not Sarah's survival, it was her son. The baby had been exposed to the fever at the most vulnerable moment of his life. He had nursed at his mother's breast while she was sick. He had slept beside her while she burned with fever. He had breathed the same air, touched her yellowed skin, ingested her infected milk. By every measure of medical understanding, he should have been dead. Infants had no resistance to yellow fever. They died faster than adults, sometimes within hours of showing symptoms, but this baby showed no symptoms at all. Not a fever, not a rash, not even a fussy night. While death walked through Magnolia Plantation, claiming victims by the dozen, while strong men and healthy women dropped like flies, the newborn baby in cabin 23 slept peacefully in his mother's arms. He fed well. He gained weight. He cried when he was hungry and quieted when he was held. He was, by every appearance, a perfectly healthy infant. The older enslaved people noticed first. They whispered among themselves, watching the baby who should have died but did not. An elderly woman named Aunt Phoebe, who had been on the plantation for over 40 years and had seen more death than anyone should have to witness, came to cabin 23 to see the child for herself. Aunt Phoebe was a respected figure among the enslaved community. She was too old for field work and served as a healer, using herbs and prayers to treat the sick when the white doctors would not come. She had delivered hundreds of babies over the years, including many who had not survived their first week. She had seen miracles, and she had seen tragedies, and she had learned to tell the difference. She held the baby in her arms, examining him closely. She looked at his eyes, his tongue, the color of his skin. She felt his forehead, listened to his breathing, watched how he moved. Then she handed him back to Sarah and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of decades of wisdom. "This child is marked by God," she said. "I have seen it only once before back in Virginia many years ago, a child born with a caul over its face who never caught any illness and lived to be 90 years old. This boy has the same blessing. No sickness will ever touch him." She paused and her voice dropped lower. "But you must guard him carefully, Sarah. You must keep this gift hidden because if the white folks find out, they will never leave him alone. They will want to know why. They will want to use him. They will take him from you and do terrible things to learn his secret. Do you understand?" Sarah understood. She had already lost 2 children to fever. She would do anything to protect this one. She named him Enoch after the biblical figure who walked with God and did not die. It was a name of hope, a name of faith, a name that carried the weight of the miracle she believed he represented. James, the baby's father, agreed to the name. He had not been allowed to attend the birth, but he came to see his son as soon as the fever released its grip on the cabin. He held the baby in his work-roughened hands and made promises that he would not be able to keep. But secrets are hard to keep on a plantation. Everyone sees everything. Everyone talks. Within a week, the whispers about the miracle baby in cabin 23 had spread to every corner of Magnolia Plantation. Within 2 weeks, those whispers had reached the main house. The yellow fever epidemic of 1855 killed over 8,000 people in Louisiana before it finally subsided in November. It was one of the deadliest outbreaks in the state's history, devastating cities and plantations alike. In New Orleans alone, over 4,000 people died. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The stench of death hung over the city for months. On Magnolia Plantation, 73 enslaved people died along with 6 members of the Whitmore family and their staff. Colonel Whitmore lost his wife, his daughter, his personal valet, 2 housemaids, and his elderly mother, who had lived in a cottage behind the main house. The financial losses were staggering. Nearly a quarter of his workforce was gone, and the cotton they would have harvested rotted in the fields for lack of hands to pick it. Colonel Whitmore emerged from the epidemic a changed man. The confident, commanding figure who had ruled Magnolia with an iron fist was gone. In his place was someone harder, colder, more calculating. The man who had always believed that wealth and whiteness could protect him from anything had learned that death did not care about the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. His wife had died in his arms. His daughter had died calling for him. All his money, all his power, all his slaves had not been able to save them. He became obsessed with understanding why some people survived and others did not. He read medical journals late into the night. He corresponded with doctors in New Orleans and beyond. He questioned his own physicians about the nature of immunity and resistance to disease. He was searching for something, anything that would explain why he had lived while his family had died. And eventually, inevitably, he heard the whispers about the baby in cabin 23. Colonel Whitmore summoned Sarah and her baby to the main house in December of 1855. It was the first time Sarah had ever set foot inside the grand structure where the Whitmore family lived. She walked through the front door, carrying Enoch in her arms, her heart pounding with fear. She did not know what the colonel wanted. She only knew that when the master summoned you, nothing good ever followed. The colonel was waiting in his study, a large room lined with bookshelves and furnished with leather chairs. He sat behind a mahogany desk, his ledgers open before him, his cold blue eyes fixed on the baby in Sarah's arms. "Set him on the desk," the colonel ordered. Sarah hesitated. The desk was covered with papers and ink bottles. It seemed wrong to place a baby there, like setting a child on an altar. "Do it," the colonel repeated, his voice carrying the tone of a man who was not accustomed to being disobeyed. Sarah placed Enoch on the desk. The baby looked up at the strange white man looming over him and began to cry. Colonel Whitmore examined the baby himself, looking for any visible sign of his supposed immunity. He checked the baby's eyes, his ears, his mouth. He felt his limbs and his belly. He looked for rashes, discoloration, anything unusual. He found nothing. Enoch looked like any other healthy infant, perhaps a bit plumper than most slave children, but otherwise unremarkable. But Whitmore was not satisfied. He had heard too many stories from too many sources to dismiss the possibility that this child was special. He needed expert confirmation. 3 days later, Dr. James Benoit arrived at Magnolia Plantation. Dr. Benoit was a physician from Baton Rouge who had gained a reputation for his research into tropical diseases. He was 45 years old, educated at the University of Pennsylvania, and considered one of the leading medical minds in Louisiana. He had published papers on yellow fever, cholera, and malaria. He had treated governors and senators. He charged fees that only the wealthy could afford. He was also a firm believer in the racial theories of his time. He believed that black people were biologically different from white people, inferior in intelligence, but perhaps superior in physical endurance and resistance to certain diseases. He saw enslaved people not as human beings, but as subjects for study, resources for scientific inquiry. When Colonel Whitmore wrote to him about a slave infant who appeared immune to yellow fever, he was intrigued enough to make the journey to Magnolia. Dr. Benoit's examination of Enoch lasted 2 hours. He brought a case full of medical instruments, tools of measurement and observation that he had used on countless patients over the years. He measured the baby's skull with brass calipers, recording the dimensions in a leather-bound notebook. He believed, as many doctors of his era did, that skull shape and size were indicators of intelligence and character. He measured the baby's limbs, comparing the proportions to charts he had developed from previous examinations of white and black infants. He examined Enoch's blood under a microscope, pricking the baby's finger to draw a sample and spreading it on a glass slide. He was searching for any visible difference from white blood samples, any anomaly that might explain the reported immunity. He found nothing unusual, but he noted this negative finding as potentially significant. He pry-cricked Enoch's skin with needles and observed how quickly the wounds healed. He listened to his heart and lungs with a stethoscope, counting the beats per minute and the breaths per minute, comparing them to established norms. He weighed him on a brass scale and recorded the result to the nearest ounce. He asked Sarah questions about the pregnancy, the birth, her own illness. He asked about the baby's eating habits, sleeping habits, bowel movements. He asked if the baby had been exposed to any other sick people since his birth. Sarah answered as briefly as possible, giving only the information that was demanded of her. She did not trust this white doctor with his instruments and notebooks. She did not trust anyone in this room. Dr. Benoit's notes from that examination, which were discovered in 1897 in the archives of the Louisiana Medical Society, reveal the assumptions and prejudices of 19th century medicine. He wrote that the Negro infant displays remarkable resistance to pathological agents, and theorized that this might be related to what he called the peculiar constitution of the African race. He speculated that some Negroes might possess a natural immunity to diseases that devastated white populations, and that this immunity might be hereditary. He did not see Enoch as a child. He did not see him as a person with a mother who loved him, a father who dreamed of teaching him to fish, a future that extended beyond the walls of this plantation. He saw him as a specimen, a puzzle to be solved, a resource to be exploited. In his final assessment, Benoit noted that further study would require repeated examinations over many years, and that the subject should be kept in optimal health to preserve his scientific value. He recommended that Enoch be fed better than the average slave child, housed separately from sick individuals, and made available for periodic examination by qualified medical professionals. Then he told Colonel Whitmore what the baby was worth. The conversation that followed changed everything. Dr. Benoit explained that medical researchers throughout the country would pay substantial sums to study a subject with apparent immunity to disease. Universities, medical societies, private physicians, even the government might be interested in examining such a rare specimen. A healthy adult male field hand in 1855 sold for approximately $1,200 at auction. Dr. Benoit suggested that Enoch's unique properties could make him worth 10 times that amount over his lifetime if properly managed. He proposed a business arrangement. Colonel Whitmore would retain ownership of the child but would lease him to interested parties for examination and study. Each examination would generate fees that would be split between Whitmore and whoever facilitated the arrangement. Over time, as the child grew and his immunity could be tested more rigorously, those fees would increase. It was, Benoit assured him, an extraordinary opportunity. That night, Colonel Whitmore wrote in his personal journal a passage that would later be used as evidence in post-Civil War trials. He wrote, and I quote directly from the original document, "The Negro child, Enoch, represents an extraordinary opportunity. I shall not sell him outright, but shall instead lease him to interested parties for examination and study. In this way, I shall retain ownership of the asset while generating substantial revenue from his unusual condition. Providence has seen fit to compensate me for my losses. He saw the death of his wife and daughter as an inconvenience. He saw the miraculous survival of a baby as a business opportunity. Sarah was not told about this arrangement. She was simply informed that her son would be moved from the cabin to the plantation infirmary, where he would be better cared for. She was told that this was a privilege, that she should be grateful. She was not told that her child had just become the most valuable piece of property on Magnolia Plantation. Enoch's childhood, if it can be called that, was unlike anything experienced by other enslaved children on the plantation. Most children born into slavery on Louisiana plantations spent their first years in the care of elderly women who were too old for field work. They lived in the slave quarters with their mothers when those mothers were not working and played with other children in the dirt roads between the cabins. By age 5 or 6, they began doing light work around the plantation, carrying water to field workers, collecting firewood, chasing birds away from the crops. By age 7 or 8, they joined the field gangs, picking cotton under the brutal sun, learning early that their bodies belonged to someone else. Enoch never picked cotton. He never carried water or collected firewood. He never played with other children in the dirt roads. Instead, he was kept in a small room in the plantation's infirmary, a building that had been constructed during the yellow fever epidemic and was now used primarily for housing sick workers until they recovered or died. His room was clean and dry, unlike the cabins where other enslaved people lived. He had a proper bed with a mattress and blankets. He ate better food than any other enslaved person on the plantation, meat and vegetables and bread, because Colonel Whitmore understood that a healthy specimen was worth more than a malnourished one. A doctor visited him regularly to monitor his health and growth. By the standards of slavery, he was treated well. But the food came at a terrible price. Several times a year, doctors and medical researchers would arrive at Magnolia to examine Enoch. They came from New Orleans, from Memphis, from Natchez and Mobile and Atlanta. Some came from as far away as Philadelphia and Boston, making the long journey south specifically to study the slave boy, who could not be killed by disease. They paid Colonel Whitmore between $50 and $200 for each visit, depending on the length and nature of their examinations. The colonel kept meticulous records of these payments, just as he kept records of everything else. His ledgers show that by 1860, he had earned over $3,000 from leasing Enoch to medical researchers. That was more than double the purchase price of the most expensive enslaved adult on the plantation. The examinations themselves were nightmares. The doctors drew blood from Enoch's veins, sometimes taking so much that the boy grew dizzy and had to lie down for hours afterward. They collected samples of his hair, his fingernails, his saliva, his urine, his feces. They measured every part of his body with calipers and tape measures, recording the dimensions in notebooks they would later publish in medical journals. They weighed him monthly and charted his growth. They photographed him using the new daguerreotype technology, creating images that were circulated among medical societies across the country. They exposed him to sick patients to see if he would catch their diseases. They brought children infected with measles and had Enoch sleep in the same bed with them for a week. The other children broke out in rashes, burned with fever, sometimes died. Enoch remained healthy. They brought adults dying of smallpox and had Enoch sit beside them for hours, breathing the same air touching their pustule-covered skin. The adults died. Enoch remained healthy. They injected him with blood taken from cholera victims using syringes that were not properly sterilized that sometimes caused infections at the injection sites. The infections healed. Enoch did not develop cholera. They rubbed typhoid-infected material into small cuts on his arms, documenting the process with detailed notes and sketches. The cuts healed. Enoch did not develop typhoid. Through all of this, Enoch remained healthy. The diseases that killed thousands every year across the South could not touch him. The doctors were fascinated. They wrote papers about him. They debated theories about his immunity. They planned increasingly invasive experiments. And through it all, Enoch endured. He had no choice. Sarah tried to protect her son. She begged Colonel Whitmore to leave him alone, to let him live like a normal child. She offered to work double shifts in the fields, to pick twice as much cotton as anyone else, to do anything if he would just let Enoch be. The colonel refused. He told Sarah that she should be grateful. Her son lived in the infirmary, not in the fields. He ate meat and vegetables while other enslaved people survived on cornmeal and fatback. What mother would not want that for her child? But Sarah knew the truth. She saw the terror in her son's eyes when the doctors came. She heard him crying in the night, calling for her, and she was not allowed to go to him. She saw the scars that accumulated on his small body from endless blood drawings and tissue samples and experimental procedures. She knew that her son was not blessed. He was cursed. His gift had made him a prisoner in ways that other enslaved people could not even imagine. James, Enoch's father, tried to help. He petitioned the colonel to let the boy work in the fields like other children, arguing that fresh air and exercise would be better for his health than confinement in the infirmary. The colonel had James whipped for his insolence. 30 lashes administered in front of the entire plantation as a warning to others. James survived, but he never petitioned the colonel again. In 1859, when Enoch was 4 years old, tragedy struck. Cholera swept through the slave quarters that September, another in the endless series of epidemics that plagued Louisiana plantations. The disease moved fast, killing victims within days of infection. The symptoms were horrific. Uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea that drained the body of fluids, leg cramps so severe that victims screamed in agony, a thirst that could not be quenched, no matter how much water they drank. Sarah fell ill on September 4th. She had been working in the fields all day, and by evening she was too weak to walk back to her cabin. Other workers carried her home, already fearing the worst. By the next morning, she was showing all the classic symptoms: the vomiting, the diarrhea, the cramping, the insatiable thirst. Enoch was brought to see his mother. The doctors wanted to observe what would happen when he was exposed to cholera in a natural setting rather than through injection. They sat the 4-year-old boy beside his dying mother and watched, taking notes, recording observations. Sarah died on September 7th after 3 days of agonizing illness. She was 27 years old. She had survived the Middle Passage that brought her ancestors from Africa. She had survived the brutality of slavery in Virginia and North Carolina. She had survived the auction block in New Orleans and the yellow fever epidemic of 1855. But she could not survive cholera. Enoch sat beside her throughout her final hours. He held her hand as much as a 4-year-old could hold anything. He did not fully understand what was happening, but he understood that his mother was in pain, that she was scared, that she was leaving him. He cried for her. He begged her not to go. She was too weak to respond. She died with her eyes open, staring at her son, trying to say something that would never be said. Enoch did not catch the disease. Of course, he did not. The doctors recorded this observation in their notebooks and discussed it among themselves, debating what it meant, what it proved, what further experiments might reveal. They did not offer the boy comfort. They did not acknowledge his grief. To them, he was not a child who had just lost his mother. He was a specimen that had just been exposed to another pathogen. James, Enoch's father, died 2 days later. The cholera took him too, along with 14 other enslaved people on the plantation. In the space of a week, Enoch had become an orphan. Aunt Phoebe, the elderly woman who had first recognized Enoch's gift, took charge of him after his parents' death. She was the closest thing to family he had left on Magnolia Plantation. The colonel allowed this arrangement because Aunt Phoebe was too old for field work and had no other duties. She could watch over the boy between medical examinations without costing the plantation any productive labor. Aunt Phoebe loved Enoch in a way that no one else on the plantation could. She had known his mother. She had delivered him into the world. She had seen the gift that set him apart and had tried unsuccessfully to protect him from those who would exploit it. Now she was determined to give him something that the doctors and the colonel could never take away. She was determined to give him knowledge. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Louisiana. The law passed in 1830 imposed fines and imprisonment on anyone who taught a slave to read or write. The reasoning was simple. Literate slaves were dangerous slaves. They might forge passes to escape. They might read abolitionist literature and get ideas about freedom. They might communicate with other slaves and organize resistance. The white population of Louisiana had decided that ignorance was the best way to keep their human property under control. But Aunt Phoebe had learned to read decades earlier, taught by a kind mistress on a plantation in Virginia who had ignored the law. She had kept this knowledge hidden for over 40 years, reading in secret, treasuring the few books she had managed to acquire over the decades. Now she shared this forbidden gift with Enoch. They met late at night after the doctors had finished their examinations, after the overseers had gone to bed, after the plantation had settled into the silence of exhausted sleep. Aunt Phoebe would come to Enoch's room in the infirmary with a tattered Bible she had hidden for decades. By the light of a single candle, she taught him to recognize letters, to sound out words, to read the stories of Moses and Daniel and Jesus. She told him about his mother, about her strength and her love, and her determination to protect him. She told him about Africa, about the homeland that their ancestors had been stolen from, about the proud civilizations that had existed there before the white men came with their ships and their chains. She told him about the God who saw everything, even when men pretended he did not exist. She told him that his gift was not an accident, that God had made him immune to disease for a purpose, even if that purpose was not yet clear. Enoch listened to everything. He absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbs rain. By age 6, he could read the Bible fluently. By age 7, he was reading whatever books Aunt Phoebe could smuggle to him. Newspapers, almanacs, even a tattered copy of Shakespeare's plays that had been discarded by the Whitmore family. But more important than reading, Enoch learned to remember. Aunt Phoebe taught him to keep a record in his head of everything that happened to him, every face that appeared before him, every name that was spoken in his presence. She knew that written records could be destroyed or confiscated, but memories were portable. They could not be taken away. They could not be burned or hidden or lost. Remember everything, she told him. Remember who hurts you and who helps you. Remember what they say and what they do. Because someday, child, someday things will be different. And when that day comes, you will need to know who your enemies are. Enoch did as she instructed. He began keeping a mental list of every person who had participated in his exploitation. The doctors who drew his blood, the researchers who injected him with diseases, the colonel who had sold his body for profit. He did not know what he would do with this list. He only knew that he would never forget. By 1860, Colonel Whitmore had earned over $3,000 from leasing Enoch to medical researchers. That was more than double the purchase price of the most expensive enslaved adult on Magnolia Plantation. The colonel saw no reason to stop. He began advertising Enoch's services in medical journals and newspapers across the South. An advertisement in the New Orleans Daily Pike from March 18, 1860 reads, "Available for medical examination. Negro male child age 5 displaying remarkable immunity to all common diseases including yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, and typhoid. Subject has been tested extensively and has never contracted illness despite repeated exposure. Terms negotiable. Inquire H. Whitmore, Magnolia Plantation, West Baton Rouge Parish." The advertisement attracted attention from beyond the medical community. It caught the eye of a man who saw opportunity not in science, but in spectacle. Reverend Josiah Crane was a traveling preacher from Georgia who made his living conducting revival meetings across the South. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, with a booming voice that could reach the back row of any tent without amplification. He dressed in black suits and white shirts, the uniform of a man of God, and he spoke of hellfire and redemption with the passion of a true believer. But Josiah Crane was not a true believer. He was a showman. He had discovered years earlier that people would pay to see miracles, and if God would not provide miracles on demand, then Josiah Crane would manufacture them himself. He had exhibited supposed faith healers who were actually just healthy people pretending to be sick. He had displayed speaking in tongues that was actually just nonsense syllables performed by hired actors. He had presented prophetic dreams that were actually just lucky guesses based on careful observation of the audience. The immune Negro boy was simply his latest attraction. Crane arrived at Magnolia Plantation in April of 1860 with a proposal that made Colonel Whitmore's eyes widen with greed. He wanted to take Enoch on tour through Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, exhibiting him at revival meetings as a living miracle, proof of God's power made manifest in human flesh. He would display the boy to thousands of people, letting them see with their own eyes that disease could not touch him. He offered Colonel Whitmore $500 for 6 months' lease, plus a percentage of the collection plate at each event. Whitmore agreed immediately. The money was too good to refuse. And so, at 5 years old, Enoch entered a new phase of his nightmare. The tour began in Vicksburg, Mississippi in May of 1860. Crane had rented a large tent and set it up at the edge of town in a field that had been used for horse trading. He plastered the town with handbills announcing the arrival of the miracle child, a boy touched by God who could not be harmed by any sickness known to man. The handbills promised that witnesses would see the power of the Almighty with their own eyes. Admission was 50 cents for adults, 25 cents for children. The format of each show was the same, refined through years of practice. Crane would begin with an hour of preaching, working the crowd into a frenzy of religious fervor. He would thunder about sin and damnation, about the wages of wickedness and the rewards of righteousness. He would have the audience singing hymns and calling out to Jesus, their voices rising to the canvas ceiling of the tent. By the time he was finished, the crowd would believe anything he told them. Then he would bring out Enoch. The boy was dressed in white like an angel, barefoot and silent. He would stand beside Crane on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces staring back at him. He was 5 years old. He did not understand why these people were looking at him the way they looked. He only knew that he was afraid. Crane would tell the audience that this child had been touched by God. He would recount the story of the yellow fever epidemic, embellishing it for dramatic effect, making it sound as though Enoch had walked through a valley of death untouched while hundreds fell around him. He would describe the medical examinations, the injections, the exposures to deadly diseases, all of which the boy had survived without a scratch. He would declare that this child was living proof that the Lord still worked miracles in the modern age. Then came the demonstrations. Crane would invite sick members of the audience to come forward. There were always sick people at these revivals. The South in 1860 was plagued by malaria, tuberculosis, influenza, and a dozen other diseases. People who could not afford doctors came to faith healers hoping for a cure. Crane gave them something better. He gave them hope. He would have the sick people cough on Enoch. He would have them touch his face, breathe directly into his mouth, press their fevered foreheads against his. He would announce that if the boy remained healthy after exposure to their illnesses, it would prove that God's protection was real. The crowd would hold its breath, watching, waiting, praying. Of course, Enoch always remained healthy. The crowds went wild. Women wept and fell to their knees. Men shouted, "Hallelujah," and praised the Lord. They threw money into the collection baskets, coins and bills, sometimes jewelry and watches, whatever they had. The baskets overflowed. Crane grew richer with every performance, sometimes earning $500 in a single night. But what the crowds did not see was what happened behind the tent after the shows. They did not see Reverend Crane beating Enoch when the boy did not perform with enough enthusiasm, when he flinched away from the sick people or cried on stage. They did not see the leather strap that Crane kept in his travel trunk, worn smooth from use. They did not see the welts it left on Enoch's back and legs, hidden beneath the white angel costume. They did not see the chains that kept the boy locked to a post at night, preventing him from running away. They did not see the bucket in the corner of Crane's wagon that served as Enoch's only toilet. They did not see the moldy bread and dirty water that were his only meals when the collections were low. To Josiah Crane, Enoch was not a child or a miracle. He was a prop, an investment, a tool for separating fools from their money. He treated the boy with the same casual cruelty that he might treat a disobedient dog. When Enoch obeyed, he was fed. When Enoch disobeyed, he was beaten. It was simple, efficient, and utterly devoid of human compassion. The tour lasted 8 months, carrying Enoch through 15 towns across 4 states. He saw Vicksburg and Natchez in Mississippi. He saw Montgomery and Mobile in Alabama. He saw Savannah and Atlanta in Georgia. He saw the insides of tents and wagons and cheap hotel rooms. He saw thousands of faces, white and black, staring at him like he was a freak in a circus sideshow. By the time Reverend Crane returned Enoch to Magnolia Plantation in January of 1861, the boy had changed. The curious, frightened child who had left was gone. In his place was something harder, something colder, something that had learned to survive by becoming invisible, by feeling nothing, by watching everything. Enoch had learned that his gift made him valuable, and valuable things were used until they broke. He had learned that white men who spoke of God often did the devil's work. He had learned that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who hurt you and those who had not hurt you yet. He had learned something else too. He had learned to remember. Every beating, every chain, every piece of moldy bread, every town, every show, every collection plate overflowing with money that he would never see. He remembered it all. He added Reverend Josiah Crane's name to the list in his head, right below Dr. Benoit and Colonel Whitmore. He did not know what he would do with that list. He only knew that he would never forget. The year 1861 brought changes that even Colonel Whitmore had not anticipated. On April 12th, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, beginning the bloodiest war in American history. Within weeks, Louisiana had seceded from the Union and joined the Confederate States of America. The cotton economy that had made planters like Whitmore wealthy was about to collapse. The war disrupted everything. The Union Navy blockaded southern ports, cutting off cotton exports to the textile mills of England and France. Prices fell. Credit dried up. The enslaved workers who had harvested the cotton were still there, still needing to be fed and clothed and housed, but there was no money coming in to pay for any of it. Medical researchers who had once traveled freely across the country to examine unusual cases now found their movements restricted by military activity. The roads were full of soldiers, not scientists. The trains carried troops and supplies, not doctors and their instruments. The stream of physicians paying to examine Enoch slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. Colonel Whitmore, facing mounting debts and declining income, was forced to find other ways to profit from his unusual asset. In September of 1861, he received a letter from Dr. Calvin Shaw, the chief medical officer at a Confederate military hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Shaw had heard about the immune Negro boy and believed that studying him might help the Confederate Medical Corps develop treatments for the diseases that were killing more soldiers than enemy bullets. Typhoid fever, dysentery, malaria, and measles swept through army camps like wildfire. More men died of sickness than of wounds. If Shaw could unlock the secret of Enoch's immunity, he might save thousands of Confederate lives. Shaw offered to purchase Enoch outright for $2,000, a significant sum even in peacetime. Colonel Whitmore refused to sell. He had learned from his years of leasing Enoch that ownership was more valuable than a one-time payment. Instead, he negotiated a long-term lease. Enoch would be sent to Richmond for an indefinite period. Dr. Shaw would pay $100 per month for access to the boy. Whitmore would retain ownership and could recall Enoch at any time. It was a businessman's arrangement, treating a 6-year-old child like a piece of medical equipment being rented out for research purposes. In October of 1861, Enoch was transported to Richmond. He traveled in the back of a covered wagon, his wrists chained to an iron ring bolted to the floor. He was 6 years old. He had never been more than 100 miles from Magnolia Plantation. Now he was being sent nearly 1,000 miles away to a city he had never seen to be experimented on by doctors he had never met. He did not cry. He had learned that crying changed nothing. He had learned that tears were a weakness that his tormentors would exploit. Instead, he sat in the back of the wagon and watched the landscape pass by through a gap in the canvas. He saw forests and rivers and small towns. He saw soldiers marching in formation. He saw the world outside Magnolia Plantation for the first time in his life. And he added more names to the list in his head. Dr. Calvin Shaw was different from the other medical men who had examined Enoch. He was not motivated by profit or fame or curiosity. He genuinely believed that understanding Enoch's immunity could save lives. He had watched hundreds of young soldiers die from diseases that should have been preventable. He had held their hands as they gasped their last breaths. He had written letters to their mothers and wives explaining that their sons and husbands had died not in glorious battle but in hospital beds killed by invisible enemies that no amount of courage could defeat. Shaw believed that science could provide answers that faith could not. He believed that somewhere in Enoch's blood or tissues or organs was the key to protecting his soldiers from the plagues that decimated them. His intentions, by the standards of 19th century medicine, were almost noble. But good intentions do not make cruelty acceptable. Dr. Shaw's examinations were more invasive than anything Enoch had experienced before. He took larger blood samples, sometimes draining a full pint at a time, leaving the boy so weak and dizzy that he could barely stand for days afterward. He performed biopsies, cutting small pieces of tissue from Enoch's skin, his muscles, and even his internal organs, all without anesthesia. All while the boy screamed in agony. He used a long hollow needle to extract fluid from Enoch's spine, a procedure so painful that even hardened soldiers cried out when it was performed on them. He injected Enoch with blood and pus taken from soldiers dying of typhoid, dysentery, gangrene, and a dozen other diseases. He documented every injection, every sample, every measurement with the meticulous precision of a scientist who had convinced himself that his work was too important to be hindered by compassion. Shaw's research notes, totaling over 300 pages, survive today in the archives of the Medical College of Virginia. They paint a portrait of a man who had lost his way in the pursuit of knowledge, a man who had started with good intentions and ended up committing atrocities that he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. For 2 years, Enoch lived in a small room in the basement of the Confederate hospital in Richmond. He had a bed, a chamber pot, and a single window that looked out at a brick wall. He was fed adequately, better than most enslaved people in the South, because Shaw understood that a malnourished subject would not produce reliable results. He was not beaten, which made his situation better than what he had experienced with Reverend Crane, but he was utterly alone. He had no contact with other children. He rarely saw the sun. His entire existence consisted of being examined, sampled, tested, and recorded. He was 8 years old, and he had already endured more medical procedures than most people experience in a lifetime. And still, he watched still, he remembered. Still, the list grew longer. In January of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were now and forever free. The proclamation did not immediately free anyone in areas still controlled by the Confederacy, but it changed the nature of the war. Now, Union soldiers were not just fighting to preserve the nation, they were fighting to end slavery. News of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Enoch through whispered conversations he overheard in the hospital corridors. He did not fully understand what it meant. He only knew that somewhere far away, a man named Lincoln had said that people like him should be free. It was the first time anyone with power had ever suggested that he was a person rather than property. He held on to that knowledge like a drowning man holds onto a rope. In April of 1865, Richmond fell to Union forces. The city that had served as the capital of the Confederacy for 4 years was now in Union hands. Confederate officials fled south, taking whatever they could carry. Dr. Shaw was among them, abandoning his hospital, his research, and his test subjects without a backward glance. Enoch was 9 years old. He had been a prisoner in that basement room for nearly 4 years. When the sounds of battle faded and the shouts of Union soldiers replaced the cries of Confederate wounded, he simply walked up the stairs and out the front door of the hospital. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. In the chaos of the city's capture, one small black boy attracted no attention at all. He was free. For the first time in his life, no one owned him. No one had the legal right to sell him, lease him, or cut pieces from his body. He stood in the streets of Richmond, surrounded by celebrating freedmen and marching Union soldiers, and he did not know what to do. He had dreamed of freedom for years, but he had never imagined what freedom would actually look like. A black woman named Ruth found him wandering near the hospital later that day. She worked as a washerwoman for the Union Army, cleaning uniforms and bed sheets for the soldiers who now occupied the city. She was 40 years old, with strong arms and kind eyes, and a voice that reminded Enoch of his mother. She could see immediately that something was wrong with him. He was thin, far too thin for a boy his age. His skin was pale from years without sunlight. His body was covered with scars, small and large, that told a story of systematic abuse. And his eyes, those were the worst part. His eyes were the eyes of an old man, tired and weary, and full of memories that no child should have to carry. Ruth took him to a camp for freedmen that had been established by Union forces on the outskirts of Richmond. She made sure he received food, clothing, and medical attention. She sat with him at night when the nightmares came, when he woke up screaming about needles and blood and men in white coats who cut pieces from him while he begged them to stop. She asked him where his family was. He told her his mother was dead, his father was dead, everyone he had loved was dead. She asked where he had come from. He said Louisiana, a plantation called Magnolia. She asked if he wanted to go back. He did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "Yes," he said. "I have to go back. There are people there I need to find." Ruth assumed he meant family members, relatives he had been separated from. She did not understand what Enoch truly meant. She could not have understood. She was a kind woman who believed that freedom meant starting over, leaving the past behind, building a new life in the ashes of the old. Enoch did not want a new life. He wanted justice. He wanted every man who had treated him like an animal to answer for what they had done. He was 9 years old and he already knew exactly what he was going to do. But first he had to survive. He had to grow. He had to learn. And so he waited. Enoch stayed with Ruth in Richmond for 2 years. He worked odd jobs around the camp carrying water, chopping firewood, running messages for the Union officers who administered the freedmen's affairs. He attended a school established by the American Missionary Association, learning to read and write properly, building on the foundation that Aunt Phoebe had given him years earlier. He was a voracious student. He read everything he could find: newspapers, history books, legal documents, even military manuals left behind by departing soldiers. He learned mathematics and geography. He learned how governments worked, how laws were made, how power was accumulated and exercised. He absorbed knowledge with an intensity that amazed his teachers. They did not know what drove him. They saw a bright, determined boy who had survived terrible things and was now making something of himself. They did not see the list of names that he carried in his head growing longer with each passing year. They did not see the cold, patient anger that burned behind his eyes like banked coals waiting for fuel. In 1867, Ruth died of pneumonia. She had been coughing for weeks, growing weaker each day, until one morning she simply did not wake up. Enoch sat beside her body for hours, not crying, not speaking, just sitting. She had been the first person since Aunt Phoebe to show him genuine kindness. She had not wanted anything from him except to see him safe and healthy. Her death hit him harder than he had expected, but it also freed him from obligation. He had stayed in Richmond partly because of Ruth, partly because he was not yet ready to begin his journey. Now there was nothing holding him. He was 12 years old, strong for his age, educated far beyond most freed men. It was time to go south. The journey took nearly a year. He worked his way down through Virginia and the Carolinas, picking up jobs wherever he could find them. He loaded cargo on riverboats. He worked in tobacco fields and sawmills. He took any job that paid, no matter how hard or dangerous. His immunity to disease made him valuable in places where sickness was common. Employers noticed that he never missed a day of work, that he could care for sick colleagues without catching their fevers. They thought him lucky. They did not understand that his luck was also his curse. He arrived in West Baton Rouge Parish in the spring of 1868. Magnolia Plantation still existed, but it was much diminished. The great house was falling into disrepair. The fields that had once produced thousands of bales of cotton were choked with weeds. Colonel Whitmore was still alive, but broken by the war and its aftermath. His son James now managed what remained of the estate. Enoch did not approach the plantation immediately. He found work at a neighboring farm and spent weeks observing, gathering information, building a network of contacts among the freed men who now lived and worked in the area. He learned that Aunt Phoebe had died in 1864. He learned that most of the enslaved people he had known as a child were either dead or scattered across the South. He was alone, truly alone, with nothing but his memories and his list. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been waiting his entire life. The years passed. Enoch grew into a man. He was not tall, but he was powerfully built with wide shoulders and hands hardened by labor. His face carried scars that told stories he never shared. His eyes, people said, were the most unsettling thing about him. They were calm, watchful, patient, like the eyes of a hunter who has all the time in the world. He educated himself further, reading every book he could find. He studied law, history, and business. He built connections with freedmen and white allies alike. He became known as a man of intelligence and integrity, someone who could help navigate the dangerous waters of Reconstruction-era Louisiana, and all the while he was hunting. The first name on his list was Reverend Josiah Crane. Finding him took 3 years. The Reverend had continued his traveling ministry throughout the war, moving constantly, never staying long enough to put down roots. But in 1871, Enoch received word that Crane had settled in Natchez, Mississippi, running a small church for a dwindling congregation. In the spring of 1872, Enoch traveled to Natchez. He found Crane easily enough. The man had aged badly. His booming voice had become a raspy whisper. His massive frame had gone soft. He still dressed in black, still preached about hellfire, but the glory days were long behind him. Enoch attended a Sunday service and sat in the back row. Crane did not recognize him. After the service, Enoch approached the Reverend and asked to speak privately. Once they were alone, Enoch locked the door and told Crane who he was. He offered the Reverend a choice: confess publicly to what he had done or die. The following Sunday, Reverend Josiah Crane stood before his congregation and confessed to years of fraud, abuse, and exploitation. He named his victims, including the slave boy Enoch, whom he had beaten and chained and starved. He wept and begged forgiveness. The next morning he was found hanging from a tree behind his church. Enoch was already gone. He felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, just the quiet knowledge that one name had been crossed off the list. 9 remained. Over the next 8 years, Enoch tracked down every man who had participated in his exploitation. Dr. Benoit fled to France after Enoch confronted him, dying alone in Paris. Dr. Shaw, already destroyed by guilt, died of heart failure months after their meeting. A slave trader was left paralyzed. An overseer was found living in poverty, already punished by fate. One by one, the names were crossed off. Some confessed, some fled, some died. Enoch felt nothing about any of it. These were simply debts being collected, tasks being completed. The final name was Colonel Harlan James Whitmore. He had always been the final name. Everything else had been preparation for this moment. By 1880, Magnolia Plantation had shrunk to barely 300 acres. The great house was falling apart. Paint peeled from the white columns. The roof leaked in a dozen places. Weeds choked the gardens where Margaret Whitmore had once cultivated prize roses. The fortune that 3 generations of Whittors had built on the backs of enslaved people was gone, consumed by war and defeat, and the slow, grinding poverty of Reconstruction. In April of 1880, Enoch rode up the drive of Magnolia Plantation, dressed in a fine suit that had been tailored in New Orleans. He rode a thoroughbred horse that cost more than Colonel Whitmore earned in 6 months. He was 25 years old, wealthy from his various business ventures, respected throughout the region as a man of intelligence and integrity. He was no longer a frightened child strapped to a medical table. He was no longer a specimen to be studied and exploited. He was a man who had come to collect what was owed. James Whitmore, the colonel's son, met him at the door with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. He did not recognize Enoch, had no memory of the slave child who had been leased out for medical experiments when James was just a boy himself, but he recognized wealth when he saw it, and he could not afford to turn away a man of obvious means. He led Enoch to a sitting room where Colonel Whitmore sat in a faded armchair, a blanket covering his useless legs, his hands trembling with palsy. The old man's eyes were clouded with cataracts, but they sharpened when he saw his visitor. Even after 20 years, even through the fog of age and illness, he recognized the boy he had sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. "You," he whispered, "the immune one. Enoch." "Yes, Colonel, I am surprised you remember me. You owned so many people over the years. We must all look the same to you." The colonel dismissed his son. Once they were alone, the old man spoke again. "So you have come to kill me." "I have considered it," Enoch replied. "I have thought about killing you every day for 20 years. You were always the last name on my list, the one I saved for the end. And the others, the doctors, the preachers, all the men who bought and sold your flesh. They have been dealt with one way or another." A long silence filled the room. Outside, birds sang in the overgrown garden. The old man who had once commanded 300 enslaved souls sat helpless before one of them, waiting to learn his fate. "I have something for you to sign," Enoch said. He laid a document on the table between them. "This is a deed to Magnolia Plantation, all 300 remaining acres. I have been buying your debts for months, Colonel. I own the notes on your house, your land, everything you have left. This deed simply makes it official." Whitmore's face went gray. "A Negro cannot own Magnolia. A Negro already does. You have been living on my property for 6 weeks without knowing it. Sign this deed and your son can remain here until you die. Refuse and I will have him removed by the sheriff this afternoon." The old man stared at the document for a long time. Then slowly, with a hand that trembled so badly he could barely hold the pen, he signed his name for the last time. There he said, "You have won. Are you satisfied?" Enoch took the deed and examined it carefully. Magnolia Plantation, the place where he had been born into slavery, the place where his mother had died, the place where his nightmare had begun, now belonged to him. "No," he said honestly. "I thought I would be. I thought this moment would feel like victory, but it does not feel like anything. You're just a sick old man in a rotting house. There is no glory in defeating you. Then why do it at all? Because you needed to know. You needed to understand before you die that the boy you treated like property grew up to own everything you valued. You will spend your final days in a house that belongs to a black man, sleeping in a bed that a black man allows you to use, eating food that a black man's money provides. That is not revenge, Colonel. That is justice. There is a difference." Whitmore died 3 weeks later. Some said it was his heart. Others said it was shame. The cause hardly mattered. Enoch transformed Magnolia into something new. He tore down the slave cabins and built proper houses. He established a school. He commissioned a memorial to everyone who had died on the plantation during slavery, inscribed with every name he could recover. He spent his final years interviewing former slaves, recording their stories, creating an archive of suffering and resilience. He reunited families that had been scattered by slavery. He built something meaningful from the ruins of his pain. Enoch died on August 14, 1903, exactly 48 years after his birth. He was found in his study, surrounded by notebooks, a pen still in his hand. The doctor could find no cause of death. His body had simply decided that its work was complete. His headstone bears a single line from Genesis, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." The legend of Enoch spread through black communities across the South. Parents told their children about the boy who could not be killed, who survived slavery and experimentation, and emerged to conquer his oppressors with patience, intelligence, and iron will. His story asks a question that we must all answer. What do we do with our pain? Enoch had every reason to become a monster, but somewhere along the way, he chose to transform his pain into something constructive. He chose to build rather than destroy. He refused to become what slavery had tried to make him. Colonel Whitmore owned Enoch's body for 10 years, but Enoch owned the next 48, and he used them to create something his oppressor could never have imagined. He was born a slave. He died a legend. That is the story of Enoch. The boy they called blessed.